over at the University of Washington, also majoring in cultural literature. And the presentation I'm about to show you is about education through the lens of Mexican Americans, highlighting the issues within the system and offering up possible solutions to fix this. But before I start, I want to start off with a quick research knowledge. I believe that this research can be applied to any race or culture, but the issue is I'm Mexican. I cannot say with full authority how the experience of another culture is because I don't know the history or the culture. And so I'm focusing on that. And when talking about research, I always believe that you must first start at the very beginning. Where did you start? What made you want to do this research to begin with? And for me, that was growing up as a Mexican American. And growing up, one of the prominent things that was really etched into my mind was this structure, hierarchy with being American at the top. There's always this pressure that you need to assimilate to be American, and anything other than American is wrong. And this causes this generational trauma within young Mexican Americans who grew up here, because the immigrant parents, as an attempt to help their children, would just not encourage them to learn the culture, not encourage them to speak Spanish at home, because it's this overarching mentality, which unfortunately causes another aspect where modern generations grew up where they're too American to be Mexican, but too Mexican to be American. And this causes issues with dual identity that have caused many of them to struggle with through life. Another thing is personal identity. The United States has this very big thing where you need to discover yourself. By college, you need to know who you want to be, what you want to do. And when one of the important aspects is that of cultural identity. And unfortunately, because of how the education system is one, that impact of cultural identity is often missing. How do you know who you are if the system in place isn't teaching you, and if the parents aren't teaching you as well? And so education plays a significant role within this formation through what you're taught, through your peer interaction, and another issue is that minoritized students experience less success in schools, lower graduation rates, and suspensions, dropout rates compared to white students. And unfortunately, this is a big issue within the system, because nowadays in modern society, you almost need a degree to get anywhere. Before they tell us, okay, with a high school, you just need to graduate high school and you can get a good, decent job. Nowadays, you at least need even an associate's or even a bachelor's just to have a decent job and not being regulated to the basic workforce, and just that we are often pushed into. So, driving question. How can we use education to address this inequality? It's obvious that there's these issues surrounding education. And instead of saying, how do we fix it without education, I think we need to use education and change it so that we can help students succeed. Within my research, I started off with the psychological approach, right? It's this issues with identity crisis. And I discovered this term, historical trauma. Now, for those of you who don't know, historical trauma is the cumulative trauma that is experienced over both the lifespan and across generations that result from massive cataclysmic events. And there are many types of cataclysmic events, but the three main types are that of genocide, colonialism, and slavery. And for Mexican Americans, that is colonialism, experienced through the Spanish, through the Mexican-American War, and also with modern racism and American colonialism after the war. Orozco Figueroa identifies three responses to historical trauma: the community response, the family response, and the individual response. Community and family response often come with the loss of language. How can you interact within a family unit when half only speaks one language and the other can't? How can you interact with the members of the community when you don't have that language that ties you together. This loss of language within the community opens up the divides between immigrants and born here, papers or without papers. And with the individual, that is mostly tied with education, right? If you, as I mentioned earlier, if your parents aren't teaching you and the education system isn't teaching you, how are you gonna learn? And this individual response often comes linked with increased vulnerability to behavioral health problems, including anxiety, depression, and substance use disorder, struggle with self-esteem, cultural belonging, and identity formation, manifest in academic underachievement, risky behavior, and social withdrawal. And within my research, I discovered that these responses are often very interconnected. If you notice one response, they always lead to another. If you have the family response, it's going to lead to the community response, because with that loss of language. If you have the individual response with a disassociation of culture and that disassociation of language, you're going to have that family response. So leads me to my interviews. For this project, I conducted 7 in-person interviews. And in my interviews, I discovered that those individuals who grew up with this strong cultural connection were more likely to go on and move into college. They had this motivation of learning and of understanding of the self. And while the strong connection didn't determine success, it did determine individual positive psychology, right? Looking at my quotes from people I've interviewed. I wish I could teach my kids, because you can't really teach something you don't know. I went from Ricardo to Richard. I Americanized my name, and I'm not sure if I like it, but at the time I thought it was the thing to do, and I liked it. Sometimes I wish I had kept my name. It was English in my house. I never learned it. I practiced a lot of Hispanic cultures, but I did not speak Spanish. I understand enough to get by. But to be honest with you, I felt pressure from family members that I don't speak it, and so that hinders me. This tie with culture is very important to feeling positive, right? How can you be comfortable in your own skin if you don't feel comfortable with yourself? How can you be happy if you have this struggle between what you think of yourself, between your family, and between society? And one that really stuck out to me, though, was my interviews with Teresa Saldívar, where she talked about her relationship with her family and how, because of growing up with this strong cultural connection, her father would teach her stories, which would inspire her to learn more, and which inspired her to go into architecture, because she learned about the Mesoamerican pyramids and was inspired by that. And it's very transformative, right? Knowing about yourself with that stable base, she was able to go forward in this complex life of college, when a lot of the times these are first generations that they don't have that base. So if their family connection isn't there, if they're not sure about themselves, if they can't rely on community to help them, they're not gonna go far. Which leads me to defenses. Within my research, I discovered 3 types of defenses as a response to historical trauma. The first is self-segregation. We're not gonna talk about that because that's very hard to do nowadays with how globalized we have our little phones and we can talk to everyone. Second one is assimilation. Assimilation is the most common because of this pressure to abandon cultures and just become American. But as established, it's not the best. It leads with the psychological issues and these loss of connection and problems with family that doesn't leave it as a sustainable defense. The third is called integration, but I like to call it mestizaje, which means the mixing of cultures. During the Spanish colonialism, indigenous Mexicans had this thing where they combined traditions with the dominant class. You can see it in a lot of Mexican traditions where there's still indigenous words, there's still certain Afro and indigenous practices within the dominant culture. And so I believe that it's important to learn how to hybridize, right? I think modern times right now is called Chicano culture, where this idea of being from here and from there. And integration allows you to move between the dominant culture and still maintain your roots. So what solutions? How can we cause this integration when you have a society that refuses to acknowledge I think that's why it's important to have ethnic studies and bilingualism. Yes, we have ethnic studies in the college, but at the point, by the time college happens, it's all this process and development already happened. It's late by then. That's why it's important to introduce this into K through 12 curricula as we address these root causes, attacking it right at the roots, right where it's beginning. And with bilingualism, it's important to one issue with the current ESL programs is that there's this focus of learning English rather than learning the subjects. So by including this of ethnic studies and bilingualism, you are preparing your students to move forward. You're giving them the tools necessary for if they want to continue on to college, they can. That's why, but it's very hard, as the person before me said, it's a very process including this in a system-wide thing. That's why it's important as teachers to have an inclusive curriculum. In one of the interviews I conducted, it was a teacher who talked about how he was a science teacher, but for the week building up to Dia de los Muertos, he'd talk a little bit about that culture and explaining it. And he noticed a very significant impact on the students. And so that's why it's important to do that little bit, because that little bit makes an impact on a person when whole life you don't learn anything about yourself. And why would you do this, right? Why if it's only good for one student, why would you do this? Because it's beneficial for all students. Ethnic studies and bilingualism it's known to broaden perspective. There's research that's showed that bilingualism is helpful in learning for children. I mean, most of Europe has this bilingual system already. Why is the United States kind of behind it? So, the United States is the land of many cultures, and more often than not, we only focus on one. And while progress has been made to focus on this, it's been rather slow. That's why it's important for teachers to do the work themselves, for parents to teach their children, and for children to want to learn. Because without knowing your culture and history, how can you know yourself? And before, I don't know if I still have time for Q&A, but before I have Q&A, this was a research paper. So if you're interested in knowing more about this research, unfortunately with 10 minutes, I don't have much time to talk more. You can scan the QR code and email me for any more questions.
We do have a couple minutes for questions. Who has something you're curious to hear more about? Carolina.
Aside from just the education perspective of having a different culture, do you think societally that would, for example, someone who is more than one race is probably very difficult. Even if you are bilingual, you grew up with the culture, it's very difficult to be accepted within that culture.
Yes, unfortunately, because I was focusing on education, I couldn't focus on the issues between multiple cultures. As I mentioned briefly, there is this tension between the idea of born here and born on the other side of the border, because it is different cultures, right? And the United States has this prominent thing where you're one or the other, right? You're Republican or Democrat, you're black or white, you're one thing, and you can only be that one thing forever. There's no gray area. And so, while it's mostly focused on education, I think that's why I include this thing where students learn, parents teach. It's important to know both sides, because you aren't one or the other, you are both.
Other questions?
What do you plan to do to alleviate this?
As a teacher, just include more inclusivity in the curriculum. Hopefully, as I rise up, I can probably implement more. But it's a very large issue that takes time. But the more I inform, the more people will probably join, because this is an issue that is important, right? Education is very important, and unfortunately, the United States right now is falling behind.